Alexandria Ocasio Cortez marched into that hearing room absolutely convinced she was about to publicly dismantle Marco Rubio, utterly blind to the fact that her own suffocating pride was about to trigger the most humiliating, career-defining silence of her entire political life. She leaned aggressively into the microphone, delivering her opening line with her whole chest, treating her words like a flag being slammed into the dirt. She proudly declared that she had spent her whole career standing alongside the Venezuelan people. All around her, the room hummed in agreement, with a handful of aides nodding right behind her. She intentionally let that bold statement hang suspended in the bright air of the hearing room, giving her supposedly legendary delivery room to breathe. Across that heavy wooden table, however, Marco Rubio offered absolutely no nods. He simply scribbled a single brief word onto a yellow legal pad, placed his pen down, and peered over his glasses at her. His face carried a look that bordered on gentle, perhaps even a bit tragic, resembling a guy who had listened to that exact same rhetoric before, spoken in a totally different tongue by folks who actually meant it deeply. Within roughly 20 minutes, that arrogant opening declaration was destined to boomerang back and totally wreck her morning. That is because a guy raised by a mother who scrubbed hotel rooms to escape a nation identical to the one she kept lecturing about was gearing up to demand one basic thing from her. He was going to push her to utter a single name, just one name, and right there in a jam-packed chamber, broadcast across 3 different networks with the red recording lights staring unblinkingly, she was going to completely choke. To truly grasp how that triumphant opening line devolved into the most agonizingly long silence of her time in office, we need to rewind about 20 minutes to the exact moment she actually thought she was walking out of there with a massive victory. The room was stuffed far beyond what the daily schedule suggested. Rumors had zipped through the Capitol that the Secretary of State was heading over to the House to face the fire on Venezuela, and whispers were swirling that the gentlewoman from New York had carved out specific time for him. Reporters were stacked 3 rows deep against the back wall, while the public gallery was crammed shoulder to shoulder. Extra spectators spilled out along the side rails, where security typically keeps the walkways totally clear. Somewhere deeply buried in the 4th row, tightly clutching a folded event program in both hands, sat an elderly woman in a plain gray cardigan. Absolutely no one was glancing her way just yet, but before the morning wrapped up, her face would be seared into the national consciousness. When Ocasio Cortez made her entrance, she walked in with that signature swagger, acting as if the very air in the room owed her a massive debt that she was here to collect. She dropped her heavy binder onto the desk with a deliberate, calculated thud. Neatly squaring up a slim pile of printed documents right next to her, she had her ammunition locked and loaded. Those papers contained the Secretary's very own historical quotes, practically glowing in bright yellow highlighter. Tugging her microphone a vital inch closer to her face, she locked eyes with the man the media had swarmed to see. She made the same calculation she always made, foolishly concluding that she had him totally figured out, because deep down to her very core, she genuinely believed Marco Rubio was a total sellout. She was convinced he was a politician who once genuinely gave a damn about Venezuelan immigrants, only to ruthlessly trade them in for a spot at the ultimate table of power. And she hit that committee room hell-bent on exposing him in front of the entire American public. She had the receipts securely in her grasp. She possessed his exact voting history regarding protected status for Venezuelan migrants, specifically highlighting the initiative he had a hand in terminating. She genuinely believed that piece of paper was a loaded weapon. The second the chairman handed her the floor, she snatched it up like a fiercely confident debater, grabbing the final word in a shouting match she felt she had been dominating for years. She started off by thanking the chairman and directly addressing Secretary Rubio, stating she wanted to be brutally honest about the reality of the hearing. Slipping effortlessly into her typical preaching cadence, She loudly proclaimed that the American public was utterly sick of political theater. She argued that regular folks were exhausted by wealthy men draped in expensive suits, hijacking the vocabulary of freedom to justify policies that literally starve young kids, fiercely demanding they skip the theatrics. A tiny murmur rippled through the packed gallery. Not exactly a cheer, but an intense, breathless anticipation. Ramping up her speed and rhythm, she pointed out that he had spent the vast majority of the year highlighting the brutal suffering of the Venezuelan population. She called his concern highly interesting, arguing that the individuals inflicting the absolute worst devastation on everyday Venezuelans, the folks actively depriving them of critical food and medical supplies, were not hiding down in Caracas. Instead, she accused some of those exact culprits of roaming the halls of that very Capitol building, with some even sitting directly at that committee table. She let that massive accusation hit the floor hard. She relentlessly pushed forward, claiming there are privileged individuals living in America who have never had to run for their lives, people who have zero clue what it actually means to starve, lose a homeland, or live in sheer terror. According to her, those exact untouched elites are the ones turning the agonizing plight of brown families south of the border into a cheap abstraction, a hollow talking point, and a political prop. She hurled that direct insult at a guy whose own mother had spent years scrubbing toilets down in a Miami hotel just to guarantee her kids would never starve in a society that kidnapped your children the second you dared to complain. She threw it right in his face, completely oblivious to the reality. And she would remain entirely clueless for another 15 minutes, fully believing she had orchestrated every single syllable of that attack perfectly to set up her ultimate victory. Rubio did not even flinch at the blatant disrespect. He possessed this incredibly specific calm, the deeply rooted patience of a guy who had navigated countless tense rooms and realized the screaming voice rarely secures the victory. He let her rant run its full course. He allowed the roaring applause she clearly anticipated to fall totally flat. Waiting just a fraction of a second past the edge of comfort, he slowly leaned into his own microphone. The very first thing out of his mouth was a calm expression of gratitude, sincerely thanking the Congresswoman. He admitted her statement was overflowing with passion, noting he did not question the fire burning behind her words. He casually slipped his glasses off, folded the arms, and rested them on the table. He told her he planned to keep his side of the exchange incredibly straightforward. He clarified he was not there to deliver some grand, sweeping speech about liberty, agreeing with her that Washington had heard way too much of that noise. Instead, he proposed they simply walk through a handful of raw facts, alongside a few of her very own quotes, firmly believing that would steer them exactly where they needed to go. She fired back with a smug invitation, telling the secretary to proceed by all means. An incredibly thin, overconfident smirk crept across her face, mirroring someone who firmly believes their opponent just blindly stepped into a massive trap. She declared she was ready to dissect her own statements, proudly standing firmly behind every single syllable. Rubio expressed his gladness at her stance, urging her to tightly hold on to that supreme confidence because they were definitely going to circle back to it. Crucially, he did not immediately grab for his documents. Anyone who genuinely understood his tactical style knew to watch for this exact maneuver. He never lunged straight for the jugular while your guard was heavily raised. Instead, he lobbed a few minor, remarkably easy questions her way, presenting them almost as polite conversational softballs. He casually asked how long she had been tracking the unraveling situation down in Venezuela. She boasted loudly that she had been ringing the alarm since her freshman year in Congress. He then questioned if she viewed herself as a meticulous, academic student of South American geopolitics, or if her fiery rhetoric stemmed mostly from a deep, emotional conscience. She proudly claimed her positions flowed from both intellect and heart, stating she saw absolutely zero contradiction there and fiercely refusing to apologize for having compassion. Rubio immediately shut down that defensive posture, calling her ma'am and assuring her absolutely nobody was demanding an apology for basic human empathy. Clasping his hands together, he stated he simply wanted to trace the exact boundaries of her outrage. He noted there is a massive difference between having a bleeding heart and carefully selecting exactly who you permit yourself to aggressively target with your anger. She shot back that she rages against sheer injustice, wherever it rears its ugly head. Rubio praised that as a solid answer, but asked for permission to stress-test it just a tiny bit. Tilting his head slightly, he brought up the historical moment when the American president, alongside the bulk of the free world, formally recognized the Venezuelan opposition leader. He reminded her she had loudly gone on the record back then, and directly asked if she recalled the exact label she slapped on that diplomatic move. She doubled down, claiming she accurately branded it an overreach and a textbook case of the exact same imperialistic reflex that had relentlessly shattered that region for 100 years. Imperialism, that was her chosen vocabulary. Rubio just nodded slowly, acting like a guy merely trying to keep the official logs perfectly tidy. He summarized her logic, asking if a guy trying to simply host a legitimate democratic vote was guilty of imperialism. He sarcastically painted himself as a simpleton just trying to keep his categories straight, asking what exactly the right word was for the ruler who violently refused to publish the results of his very own ballot boxes. She defensively fired back that she has constantly slammed anti-democratic maneuvers erupting on all sides. All sides. He let those two incredibly evasive words hang in the heavy air for a long second. He pointed out her relentless addiction to plural nouns, highlighting her constant use of broad terms like all sides, the region, and the dynamics. He called them massive, sweeping words that provided plenty of dark corners for cowards to hide inside. Shifting gears, he decided to toss her a remarkably simple, direct question, one so basic even he could supposedly track it. He asked if, throughout all her years of passionately preaching about Venezuela from her deeply bleeding heart, she had ever once, on live television or in print, explicitly branded the man suffocating that country as a dictator. The entire hearing room plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence, the specific kind of dead air that drops when everybody desperately craves the truth, but is terrified of the fallout. She deflected again, stating she has continuously fought back against authoritarianism in every single shape it takes. He sharply corrected her, clarifying that was absolutely not what he had just asked. He pressed her on one specific man, demanding to know if she ever actually used the word dictator regarding that one name. She frantically pivoted, claiming she fundamentally opposed the anti-democratic policies of his specific government, specifically their blatant refusal to release the actual voter tallies. His government. Rubio nodded with deliberate slowness, looking exactly like a diner patron who just got handed the precise meal he ordered and wanted to admire the plate before digging in. He emphasized her choice to blame his government instead of the man himself. He told her to hold on to that weak excuse too, warning her she was juggling a lot of loose threads and hoping they would not get too heavy to carry. And then he executed the ultimate tactical pivot that absolutely nobody saw coming, a devastating move that totally flipped the entire morning upside down. It worked beautifully, because she literally could not see the jaws of the trap snapping shut. He did not whip out some hostile conservative op-ed to batter her with. Instead, he reached all the way across the ideological aisle and picked up a single piece of paper from his own neat folder. Glancing down at it, a faint look of almost genuine admiration washed over his features. He casually mentioned she had penned something a little while ago regarding this precise crisis. He admitted she had articulated the point way better than he ever possibly could. Because of that, he refused to butcher her prose with his flat, working-class Miami accent, wanting to ensure she could never accuse him of reading it coldly, twisting her tone, or stripping away the context. He gently slid that printed page directly across the polished wood toward her, leaving it face up so she could stare right at her very own quote. He told her those were her exact words, published under her own name, and politely requested she do the room a massive favor by reading her own sentence into the microphone so nobody could cry foul about him putting words in her mouth. She looked down at the document. You desperately need to understand exactly why she grabbed that paper, because if you miss this crucial psychological element, you will wrongly assume she was just an idiot. She was not stupid at all. She was fatally arrogant. The text printed on that sheet represented a core ideology she fiercely believed in. She had aggressively peddled those exact talking points across cable news networks and defended them relentlessly on a dozen different platforms without an ounce of regret. He was not tossing her a scandalous, leaked email. He was handing her what she genuinely considered her absolute most devastating ammunition. He was literally rolling out the red carpet for her to prosecute her own case, utilizing her own celebrated voice. Since the political machine had spent years blowing smoke about her voice being her greatest superpower, she saw absolutely no danger. She only saw a massive, glowing spotlight. She snatched up the paper and projected the words with total authority. Completely convinced of her own righteousness, she read that any serious attempt to solve the asylum nightmare must originate by examining the American foreign policy and the massive global dynamics actively fueling it. Her chin tilted upward in defiance as she loudly recited that the sweeping, broad sanctions pushed by Trump and Rubio played a colossal part in forcing millions of desperately poor civilians to flee Venezuela. She finished by reading that any legitimate conversation regarding asylum seekers needed to confront those exact American policies head-on. She slammed the paper back down and shot him a look of absolute triumph. She firmly believed she had just permanently cemented her ultimate thesis into the congressional record using her own flawless phrasing. She boldly confirmed she authored it and aggressively stood by every letter. She pointed her finger and declared that the heavy sanctions he had personally championed directly chased millions out of their homeland. She shouted that the massive exodus was heavily documented, brutally real, and composed of actual broken families. She sneered at the secretary, telling him he could grimace all he wanted, but he possessed zero power to make their devastating reality disappear. Rubio shot back softly, calling her mom once more and swearing he would never dream of erasing their pain. He quietly stated he personally knew those exact families. He let that heavy, intimate truth sit for one agonizing second. He then genuinely thanked her for reading the text, complimenting her strong delivery and noting she sounded incredibly authentic. Leaning forward just a single inch, he promised he only had one incredibly tiny request left before moving on. He pointed out she had explicitly woven 2 specific names into that short paragraph. She had dragged his name into the mud, and she had plastered the president's name right next to it, making her targets glaringly obvious. With icy precision, he challenged her to gaze back down at that same page and read out loud the exact section where she dared to name the actual tyrant those millions of refugees were desperately sprinting away from. She scrambled, frantically glancing at the printout. She defensively snapped that the core sentence was entirely focused on economic sanctions. He calmly replied. He totally grasped her spin, but relentlessly demanded she locate the name of the dictator who ruined the country they fled. He ordered her to read his name straight off her own brilliant manifesto. She furiously pushed back, barking at him, accidentally calling him senator before quickly correcting it to secretary, while arguing his name was totally irrelevant to the broader point. He absorbed the hit without throwing an ounce of anger back, which magically made the counterpunch strike 100 times harder. He agreed. He heard her loud and clear. He calmly affirmed that the tyrant's name was completely missing from her statement. He pointed out that this glaring omission was exactly his ultimate argument. He fiercely noted she managed to author an entire thought, blaming America for why 8 million human beings abandoned their lives, finding plenty of ink to attack 2 American politicians. Yet somehow, she miraculously failed to find any room whatsoever to explicitly name the one monstrous individual whose brutal torture chambers those people were frantically escaping. He reminded her she just blasted it over the loudspeakers for the whole world to hear. He pointed to the massive wall of text she had written, brutally concluding his name was absolutely nowhere to be found. That was the precise moment the very first chuckle cracked the tension. It was not a booming roar, but a low, spontaneous snicker rolling straight out of the spectator gallery. A guy sitting in the third row literally had to slap his hand over his mouth to choke back a laugh, while a uniformed marshal pacing the side rail suddenly found the carpet incredibly fascinating. She had meticulously drafted a massive critique of American strategy, totally scrubbed the murderous dictator's name from the document, and then arrogantly read it to a nationwide audience, without even realizing she was digging her own grave. It was a devastating realization. But this was exactly the moment she desperately tried to counterpunch, throwing absolute haymakers to regain control of the narrative. Ocasio Cortez was absolutely not the type of politician to just roll over and let a room slip away in silence. She had navigated hostile waters before, totally understood the brutal terrain of Washington, and instantly executed her classic survival tactic whenever the floorboards started rotting beneath her boots. She immediately attempted to hijack the entire premise of the debate. She sneered that she saw exactly what kind of dirty game was being played. Her tone spiked violently upward, locking right back into its signature abrasive power, because pure, unfiltered rage was the only political arena where she ever truly felt bulletproof. She angrily slammed the entire exchange as a cheap, calculated performance. She accused him of being a slick operative, masterfully manipulating a heavy dialogue about genuine human agony into a viral internet clip. She sarcastically challenged the secretary to start throwing names around if he suddenly cared so desperately about them. She aggressively pivoted the conversation straight toward temporary protected status. She demanded they discuss the 500,000 Venezuelan migrants residing legally inside America, people who sprinted away from the exact same brutal regime he kept endlessly lecturing her about. She ruthlessly pointed out that he personally, using official ink, instructed the Department of Homeland Security to actively deport them. She triumphantly held up one of her own heavily highlighted documents. Her grip did not shake, and the attack was undeniably vicious. She read his past quote back to him, noting he formally declared that shielding those migrants directly clashed with the national interest. She accused him of masquerading as their ultimate champion for 15 years, only to ruthlessly throw them straight under the bus, the absolute second it became politically convenient. She viciously ordered him not to sit in that chair and lecture her about who genuinely bleeds for the Venezuelan people. She screamed that he had 500,000 of them tucked away safely and actively stamped their return postage. And you have to hand it to her. That brutal hook actually connected. The journalists crammed at the back tables, furiously started scribbling. A young aide standing directly behind her passionately nodded twice. Even the woman near the front, who had chuckled just seconds prior, stared awkwardly at her lap. Every single word she shouted was a deeply verified matter of public record. For a fleeting, breathless second, the entire energy of the massive room violently whipped around and surged straight back into her corner. She felt the adrenaline spike. She rode that massive wave, and the momentum genuinely seemed to stabilize. You could practically feel the old, familiar progressive magic flooding back into the space like a rising tide. Right behind Rubio, an assistant leaned aggressively forward, whispering 2 incredibly fast sentences directly into his ear, tightly cupping a hand over his mouth to block any lip readers. The broadcast cameras completely caught the secretive exchange. Nobody in the public had a clue what was muttered. Rubio absorbed the secret intel without even turning his neck. He offered a nearly microscopic nod in return. Whatever nuclear secret was just handed to him, it completely failed to alter his facial expression by even a fraction of a millimeter. He casually dragged one of his closed folders a quarter-inch closer to his fingertips, refusing to crack it open. The entire audience locked onto that movement. You could physically feel the collective heartbeat of the chamber staring down that sealed manila folder. By refusing to reveal the contents, he cranked up a psychological pressure cooker that no amount of screaming could ever replicate. He let that suffocating tension simmer for roughly 15 agonizing seconds. He easily could have stretched it out forever, but Rubio totally refused to blink. He completely rejected the urge to get defensive. He outright ignored the incredibly predictable path her vicious attack was designed to force him down. He refused to get bogged down loudly, arguing the boring, microscopic details of immigration law, and subsequently lose the audience to legislative boredom. He let her finish her screeching entirely. He let the heavy accusations settle completely into the floorboards, and then he countered with something far more devastatingly quiet than anyone in Washington was remotely prepared to handle. He calmly told her she was absolutely right. The entire chamber completely froze. He agreed she was totally right about him backing the termination of that specific protection. He admitted it was a brutally agonizing decision. He confessed there were genuine families devastated by the move. He then hit her with a brutally flat, deadpan delivery, stating he had agonized over those broken families way more intensely than she would ever believe a wealthy guy in a sharp suit could ever care about anything. He delivered the line stripped of all theatrical poison. That cold, level honesty stung infinitely harder than any manufactured outrage. He refused to stand at the microphone and sell the room a fake story about it being an easy or painless policy shift. It brutally was not. He told her if she really wanted to drag the whole room through that specific mud, they absolutely could. And he even conceded she might walk away with a few points. However, he ruthlessly pointed out that was absolutely not the specific war she marched in there to launch. He ripped the mask off her strategy, declaring she stormed into the hearing strictly to broadcast to the American public that he despised Venezuelans. He demanded they rip that exact narrative open, largely because he genuinely suspected she believed her own lie. He hypothesized she had fallen for her own spin, simply because she had never been forced to experience the harsh reality of the gutter. And right in that massive, heavily guarded room, something monumental finally broke inside of him. The polished, heavily managed diplomat completely vanished. The meticulously rehearsed, massively approved Secretary of State evaporated into thin air. The only thing sitting in that chair was a scrappy, working-class kid forged in the brutal heat of West Miami. He stared straight ahead and stated his mother scrubbed filthy hotel rooms for a living. The massive room grew terrifyingly silent. He recounted how his dad manned a bar at lavish parties, serving endless cocktails to wealthy elites who never gave a damn about his name, pouring drinks until 2 a.m, only to drag himself home and repeat the miserable grind all over again. He explained they endured that backbreaking labor right here on American soil strictly because they had permanently fled a ruined island. They escaped a place where one single maniac had decided citizens lost the right to travel, lost the right to complain, and lost the basic human right to pick their own destiny. He reminded her that if anyone dared to push back, that specific maniac had very dark holes to throw them in. He slapped one palm totally flat onto the cover of that exact same closed folder resting by his elbow, the very one the media lenses had been hawking. Finally, he flipped the cover open. He absolutely did not rip out some dense legislative report to angrily wave in her face. Instead, he carefully extracted a solitary, faded photograph. It was visibly ancient, with the bright colors bleeding out into a soft blur. He refused to spin it around for the thirsty network cameras. He simply stared at it for a heavy moment, then placed it face up on the polished wood where only the front row could catch a glimpse. He quietly revealed it was a picture of the hotel. An anonymous supporter had apparently mailed it directly to his office earlier that exact morning because they knew precisely what the hearing was slated to cover. He described the image as the grimy loading dock. His mother trudged through every single morning for 11 grueling years. He admitted he kept the photo close because, whenever he was forced to endure insufferable days like this one, he found it incredibly grounding. It brutally reminded him that the screaming refugees they were debating were absolutely not a political abstraction. They were real people who clocked in through back alleys, punched cheap time cards, and carried names that none of the wealthy partiers ever bothered to memorize. He gently folded the manila cover back down. He noted she kept relentlessly regurgitating a very specific phrase. She had aggressively deployed it twice already that morning. He mocked her claim that millions were somehow frantically running from American sanctions. Shaking his head in total disbelief, he told the congresswoman he was literally raised right alongside those broken people. He poured them coffee. He sat right inside their cramped kitchens. He forcefully declared they were absolutely not sprinting away from a piece of American legislation. A sanction, he noted, is just a meaningless sheet of paper. They were running for their lives from the exact monstrosity she had spent 6 agonizing years wandering the halls of Congress, completely refusing to pin a single name on. She fiercely snapped back, declaring he did not get to play that game. Now, there was genuine, boiling fury in her voice. She could feel the entire room slipping rapidly through her fingers, so she violently reached for the absolute most toxic maneuver that had always bailed her out. She screamed that he had zero right to weaponize his own sob story to forcefully silence a legitimate debate on public policy. She branded it a completely dirty trick. She accused him of deliberately wrapping a catastrophic political failure inside a tear-jerking story about his poor mother, violently daring anyone to challenge the logic. She claimed he deliberately set up a trap where anyone disagreeing with the math was suddenly accused of verbally assaulting his mom. She insisted she was strictly attacking his abysmal voting record, totally ignoring his mother, arguing they were completely separate issues. She loudly accused him of acting like a total coward, hiding securely behind one to totally dodge the other. It was undeniably a savage counterattack. Frankly, it was the absolute strongest piece of ammunition she possessed. For a microscopic second, the massive room wobbled back toward her corner, mostly because there was a tiny shred of brutal truth buried in the rhetoric. Politicians absolutely use their past as a bulletproof vest, and she had just loudly exposed the entire playbook. The savage disruption honestly might have saved her career, but it was at that exact, terrifying fraction of a second of dead air that followed her massive rant that the elderly lady wearing the gray cardigan slowly stood straight up in the 4th row. She completely bypassed the screaming. She just rose to her feet with agonizing slowness, her hands still desperately strangling the folded event program. A security guard instantly lunged in her direction, exactly like they are trained to do. Rubio spotted her immediately and swiftly threw one hand slightly in the air toward the man holding the gavel. He softly addressed the chairman, humbly begging for the committee's strict indulgence just for a split second, demanding they let the stranger speak her mind. The chairman paused awkwardly, then firmly nodded, forcing the guard to freeze in his tracks. The old woman's voice rattled and shook. She pushed her words out in broken, heavily accented English. She spoke with the agonizing caution of a person who knows every single syllable carries a massive, bleeding price tag. She told the chamber her actual name was totally meaningless. She announced she hailed from Maracaibo and dragged herself to America back in 2018. Her eyes locked dead onto the exact piece of paper, still trapped inside Ocasio Cortez's fist. The the specific page completely plastered in bright yellow highlighter. She told the congresswoman she heard her screaming that Venezuelans were fleeing economic sanctions. She noted she had been forced to listen to a whole bunch of politicians parrot that exact same lie. She announced she was there to definitively educate the room on exactly what they were desperately running from. Her wrinkled knuckles turned stark white as she crushed the paper program. She told the silent room that the regime snatched her boy back in 2017. He was only 24 years old. He marched straight into a street protest and simply never walked back through the front door. For 9 agonizing months, she had zero clue if he was even breathing. She described the sheer horror of finally being granted access to him, revealing he could not even lift a basic plastic cup of water strictly because of the sheer butchery they inflicted upon his hands. She did not shed a single tear. She had pushed far past the luxury of crying. She locked eyes with the congresswoman, stating she had endured listening to her preach for countless years because she was massively famous and supposedly championed the voiceless. But she viciously pointed out that throughout all those endless years, she never once heard her utter his actual name. The specific name of the monster carrying the total destruction of her boy's hands heavily on his blackened soul. She accused the politician of constantly exploiting her nation's name. She noted she relentlessly attacked the American secretary's name. Nodding aggressively at Rubio, she delivered the final blow, stating she absolutely never dared to say the dictator's name. She slowly collapsed back into her chair. Nobody dared to breathe a single laugh. That raw truth detonated somewhere incredibly deep, sinking into the absolute darkest foundation of a room where careers are instantly made or permanently slaughtered. It was a brutal reality check that set the stage for a wild aftermath, accelerating rapidly toward the precise moment. Her entire manufactured demeanor completely collapsed in front of the nation. Ocasio Cortez's mouth popped wide open, and for the absolute first time all morning, not a single clean word managed to escape. She stammered out a deeply awkward apology for the woman's brutal tragedy. It actually sounded genuine. You could physically hear the raw panic bleeding through. She frantically swore she would never, ever attempt to minimize the agony she had just outlined. Rubio sliced completely through the rambling apology. He did not do it with vicious cruelty, but with a terrifyingly quiet, almost compassionate tone that forced every single person in the room to physically lean forward just to catch it. He addressed her as Mom once again, assuring her he totally believed her apology was real. He clearly stated he did not view the congresswoman as a fundamentally evil human being. He practically demanded the stenographer put that specific defense onto the permanent record. However, he ruthlessly noted he considered her to be something significantly harder to forgive inside the rotting swamp of Washington. He directly accused her of making a calculated, cold-blooded decision a very long time ago regarding exactly which sovereign nations were officially permitted to be branded as villains, and the butcher operating down in Caracas was miraculously never stamped onto her approved hit list. He stated that explicitly naming him would have forced her to publicly confess that the exact socialist ideology she had spent her entire professional life violently defending possesses the terrifying capacity to completely destroy a human being. He threw a micro-gesture toward the broken mother draped in gray, specifically pointing straight toward her son's shattered hands. Ocasio Cortez desperately pleaded with him, saying with all due respect, he cut her off dead, warning her they had burned far past the boundary of respect. He delivered the line without screaming, dropping it with the exhausted gentleness of a guy who had literally drained every single drop of patience in his entire body. He stated that mutual respect officially died 20 minutes ago. He declared respect evaporated. The exact moment she arrogantly stood up and practically yelled that broken humans fleeing violent tyranny were nothing but a cheap political prop. He hammered home that she dared to spew that garbage into a room containing a devastated mother who literally buried her own child's freedom deep inside a torture cell. He reached across and completely hijacked her printed document right off the wood, the exact paper she had so proudly recited aloud just moments prior. He hoisted it high in the air, guaranteeing the camera lenses caught every inch of it, parading it around exactly like a prosecutor holding a smoking gun. He brutally reminded her she stomped into the room that morning, hell-bent on forcing him to confess he felt zero empathy for broken immigrants. He mocked her master plan, pointing out that instead, she totally willingly blasted her own hypocritical sentence out of her own mouth, a sentence heavily loaded with his name, yet completely scrubbed clean of the dictators. He slapped the paper flat against the desk. He accused her of trying to forcefully gag him using the sheer volume of their suffering. He pointed out her ultimate failure: she could not even summon the basic courage to scream his name. He utilized exactly 11 words at the very end of his massive takedown. Perhaps it was only 10. Regardless, those few words inflicted a level of absolute devastation that 10,000 hours of shouting could never have achieved. The entire chamber plunged into an absolute, suffocating dead silence. Alexandria Ocasio Cortez slowly dropped her gaze, staring blankly at the tiny pile of printed paperwork resting near her elbow. The exact documents she had arrogantly hauled into the fight, the aggressively highlighted ones. The very weapon she smugly assumed was totally loaded when she swaggered through the heavy wooden doors. She stared blankly at them for a massively long, agonizing moment, and then, incredibly quietly, with the unblinking red lights of the broadcast cameras totally locked onto her face, she slowly scraped them into a neat pile. Driven strictly by raw, nervous reflex, she perfectly squared up the jagged edges. She then totally flipped the entire stack violently face down onto the table. She creased the paper firmly straight down the middle. She pushed the ruined documents several inches away from her body, aggressively shoving them toward the dead space on the desk. It was the exact physical motion a broken person uses when abandoning a tool they finally accept is totally useless. She mindlessly grabbed her pen. It was the frantic reaction of a politician totally desperate to pretend they had incredibly vital notes to scribble, desperate to busy their shaking hands. She dangled it awkwardly over the yellow pad. Ultimately, she just completely dropped it back onto the wood, without managing to write a single, solitary letter. The chairman coughed loudly, violently shattering the brutal silence. He strictly followed the parliamentary rules, formally asking if the gentlewoman wished to proceed with her attack since she technically still had plenty of time lingering on the clock. She absolutely did not. She surrendered her time using exactly 2 defeated words. She whispered that she yielded. In a massive, crowded chamber where you legitimately could have heard a single pin crash into the carpet. Incredibly dry. Rustle of her own papers, flipping face down, easily became the absolute loudest noise captured on the official microphones. If you bother to rewind the tape and analyze it, that exact friction is the defining sound of an arrogant operative who marched in to totally dismantle an opponent, only to realize on a massive national broadcast that she packed the completely wrong artillery. Her ultimate downfall was entirely fueled by her own arrogant vocabulary. Those words were fully armed the entire time. Tragically for her, the barrel had been shoved right between her own eyes from the very beginning. Long before the chairman officially dropped the gavel, the viral footage had already earned a brutal nickname. The title was completely humiliating for her brand. Some aggressive operative had flawlessly sliced up a perfect 90 seconds highlight reel. It showcased her viciously screaming her own flawed statement, totally high on her own supply. It immediately hard-cut to his deadly whispered demand for the completely missing name. The video brutally ended with her pathetically flipping her own ammunition completely face down onto the wood. They dumped it straight onto the internet. By the middle of the afternoon, it was completely impossible to scroll past 10 seconds on any digital screen inside America without that exact humiliation blasting back into your face. The absolute most terrifying aspect of the entire disaster, assuming she even possessed the capacity to process anything past the burning humiliation radiating off her cheeks, was that the public was totally done arguing. They had stopped fighting over the minutiae of economic sanctions. Nobody cared about foreign diplomacy, immigrant status, or any of the heavily scripted talking points she had desperately tried to shove down the nation's throat that morning. The debate was completely dead. Instead, millions of voters were just trapped endlessly, watching a politician proudly recite an arrogant sentence loaded with American names, totally fail a basic request for a third name, and sit there paralyzed without a single defense, running on an endless digital loop. Every single major evening news broadcast violently kicked off their program using that exact frozen frame. The shot of the Congresswoman resting her defeated hand over the flipped stack of heavily highlighted pages. One major network ruthlessly aired the footage underneath a lower third graphic, entirely composed of the secretary's devastating final remark. It was just stark white font slapped across a pitch-black background. Absolutely no punditry was tacked on, because none of it was remotely required. Out in the freezing marble corridor directly outside the hearing room, an aggressive journalist practically cornered a prominent Democratic congressman. This was a guy who had proudly slammed his voting button right alongside Ocasio Cortez countless times over their careers. He totally refused to let the reporter print his name. He frantically scanned both ends of the hallway like a paranoid criminal before daring to open his mouth. He whispered incredibly fast, confessing that every single operative in their camp had secretly known for years she harbored a massive, crippling blind spot regarding that specific dictator. He admitted the entire progressive machine basically formed a silent pact to entirely avoid triggering the subject. He mockingly pointed out that inside their bubble, you were allowed to hurl any vile insult imaginable at Israel. But absolutely nobody dared to utter a bad word about that specific maniac hiding out in Caracas. He noted they had maintained total silence for years. Shaking his head in disbelief, he muttered that she finally stepped on a massive landmine, getting pressed on live television by the absolute only guy in Washington whose family actually survived the nightmare. He bluntly concluded that no amount of slick PR spin could ever patch that bleeding wound. He practically ran away before the journalist could even click the record button. A junior staffer, who had spent the entire hearing desperately clinging to the back railing, called her buddy that very evening to unpack the trauma. She was deeply embedded in the Democratic machine. She confessed she absolutely could not flush the nightmare out of her brain, admitting she felt highly incredibly dirty, even vocalizing it over the phone. She insisted it had absolutely nothing to do with the actual political stakes. Honestly, she could not care less about the legislative fallout, not after burning through a brutal 4-hour shift. It was purely the agonizing audio of those printed pages forcefully slamming onto the wood inside a room so dead you could physically feel the oxygen drain. The microscopic, papery scrape of defeat followed instantly by total, suffocating nothingness. She solemnly swore the sheer weight of that nothingness would echo inside her head for a very long time. She branded it the absolute loudest, most terrifying silence she had ever endured. She shockingly admitted she had totally lost the ability to even make eye contact with the Congresswoman after the meltdown. Even crazier, she confessed she could not entirely pinpoint exactly why her respect evaporated. As for the elderly woman draped in the gray cardigan who traveled from Maracaibo, she eventually drifted out of the Capitol building totally alone. She walked with a brutal slowness, still clutching that crushed event program. Tucked away deep in a hidden corridor, totally shielded from the bloodthirsty media lenses, the Secretary of State was quietly standing near an exit door. He was only there because he explicitly tracked down a security aide to find out where the broken mother disappeared to. He absolutely refused to deliver a grandstand speech. He completely banned any photographers from documenting the moment. He simply reached out and tightly wrapped both of his hands totally around hers for a fleeting second. He whispered a few hidden words directly to her in perfect Spanish, speaking far too softly for any roaming spy to ever intercept. She slowly nodded her head, and that was literally the end of the exchange. He let go of her hands and marched in the total opposite direction. He completely ignored the screaming journalists desperately chanting his name. He walked right past the completely abandoned committee room where the absolute most heavily quoted progressive in the entire Capitol building had miraculously, after all these loud years, finally run completely dry of talking points. He had completely exhausted 15 years aggressively, screaming the violent dictator's actual name into the void. He casually muttered it strictly, one last time, as he shoved the exit door wide open. He said it quietly to nobody in particular. He delivered it exactly like a guy uttering a brutal truth that he was absolutely never, ever going to quit repeating. It was the ultimate testament that a bartender's son who watched his parents scrub filthy floors fundamentally grasped the concept of liberty, infinitely better than a politician who merely regurgitated focus-grouped buzzwords for the process television cameras. Because it brutally turns out, the absolute most devastating weapon deployed in that massive room was not a slick piece of legislation. It was absolutely not a heavily rehearsed monologue. It was just a single, undeniable name. And the terrifying, career-ending silence exactly where it absolutely should have been.